a global treaty to end plastic pollution. You know, it all started with this incredible optimism, but it ended in deadlock and just anger. Today on The Explainer, we are digging into what exactly went wrong.
So why was this treaty such a big deal? Well, it really comes down to numbers like this one, 70%. That's how much plastic production is set to grow by 2040 if we just do nothing. And when you realize less than 10% of all plastic has ever been recycled, you can see why the world decided it was time to act.
Okay, so to really understand how it all fell apart, we've got to go back to the beginning. Back when this plan was launched with just huge optimism and a really powerful mandate. So rewind to 2022. 175 countries agree to do something historic. Create a legally binding treaty to tackle plastic across its entire life cycle. You know, from the moment it's made to the moment it's thrown away. But after some early talks stalled, everything, and I mean everything, came down to one final high-stakes meeting in Geneva.
But, as the negotiations went on, that initial unity, well, it just fractured. The world basically split into two deeply divided camps, each with a completely different and, as it turns out, incompatible vision for what this treaty should actually do.
And right here, this was the core conflict. On one side, you had the High Ambition Coalition. That's a majority, over 100 nations, and they demanded legally binding cuts to plastic production itself. Then, on the other side, you had a small but powerful group of oil-producing states who insisted the treaty should only focus on waste management, with measures that were purely voluntary.
So this fundamental clash, it all came to a head in Geneva. During the final, absolutely frantic days of negotiations, the pressure was on to find some kind of compromise. But a last-ditch effort to save the deal? Well, it had the exact opposite effect.
In an attempt to bridge this massive divide, the meeting's chair presented two new draft versions of the treaty. But the reaction from that ambitious majority? Whoa, it was swift and it was absolutely brutal.
The European Union, a huge economic bloc and a key player here, immediately rejected the draft. They just called it unacceptable, arguing it failed to meet even the bare minimum standard for tackling plastic pollution. Other nations were even more visceral. Panama's delegation called the proposal repulsive, declaring that accepting it wasn't a compromise, it was a complete and total surrender.
And Mexico's head of delegation, Camila Zepeda, was just as blunt. She argued it wasn't a real treaty at all, but simply an empty shell. Basically a document that looked like a solution, but had absolutely nothing of substance inside.
And the reason for all this outrage was crystal clear. The compromise drafts had been watered down so much, they removed all the legally binding cuts to production and chemicals that the majority demanded. This left a treaty with no teeth, and for over 100 countries, that was way worse than no treaty at all.
So why? Why did it all fall apart so spectacularly? Well, beyond the public disagreement, there were two critical factors at play behind the scenes, and they effectively paralyzed the whole process.
The first reason really comes down to this number, 234. That's how many fossil fuel and chemical industry lobbyists were officially registered to attend the talks in Geneva.
And just to put that number into perspective, those 234 lobbyists actually outnumbered the entire combined delegation from all 27 EU nations. They also outnumbered the official scientists coalition by nearly 4-1, which, raised some serious concerns about corporate influence.
Okay, so that was one thing. The other major reason was a procedural roadblock. It was a rule of the negotiations that critics have called the consensus trap. So in these UN talks, every major decision had to be made by consensus. Now, that sounds good, right? But what it actually means is that everything requires unanimity. This gives every single country, no matter its size or stake, a veto.
And in practice, the trap worked just like this. The majority of nations would propose a strong measure, like production cuts. The small group of petrostates would object. And because of that consensus rule, progress would grind to a halt. And the proposal was either blocked or weakened into that empty shell that was ultimately rejected.
So, with the official process completely deadlocked, the big question is, what happens now? Well, experts say there are basically three potential paths forward. Okay, path number one, try again within the UN, but with a critical change. Add a voting rule, like a 2/3 majority, to stop a small group from blocking everything. Path two, the high ambition countries could form a coalition of the willing and just create their own stronger treaty. Or path three, they could try to build on existing environmental agreements to tackle plastics.
And this all really comes down to a powerful belief held by the majority of these nations. No deal is better than a bad deal. They argue that a weak, voluntary treaty would only legitimize inaction. It would just give polluters cover to continue business as usual.
Which leaves us with this final and honestly pretty provocative thought. The collapse of these talks raises a huge question. In a world with such deeply entrenched economic interests and procedural gridlock, can a problem that affects every single one of us ever have a truly global solution?